Welcome to this joint Conservative Home One Campaign live event. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and I'm going to be taking us all through the next hour and a quarter or so. So in a few moments, I'll make some introductory remarks, but first of all, let me just lay out the landscape for how this event is going to work. So, first of all, I will do a brief introduction. Then our four speakers will, for 3 minutes or so, speak. After that, I will ask a few questions of my own. And then you will all be able to come in, please, using the Q&A function. If you put your questions in to Q&A, I will pick them up and ask them around the panel. So let me set the scene for this event on global Britain and the future of vaccination. In this way, it's really been something like 2 years last month, since the pandemic was declared. And here in the UK, there's really danger, I suppose, in a way, that we forget all about much of it, or some of us do, as we rush on to whatever the next big development is, like the war in the Ukraine that's taking place at present. And it's easy to forget that our treatment of the pandemic has had its highs and has had its lows. But one enormous plus for global Britain was the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine under the leadership of the task force set up by Kate Bingham, which we returned to on Conservative Home last week and looked at in some detail. So I suppose the question now, looking forward, is what happens to that enterprise and to global Britain in other parts of the world where the pandemic is still going on and where there are still a mass of closures and restrictions? What can we do to help open up trade, to boost economic growth, to ease international travel, again, to get back to normal, whether that is in terms of debt relief, whether it's in terms of logistics, helping other countries develop vaccines there, whether it's in terms of helping to open up the world economy again, or whether it's in the most simple terms of all, of getting needles into arms. So without any more ado, I'm going to go to the first of our four speakers tonight, who is the Minister, Vicky Ford, Minister for Africa, and now as well, Minister for Latin America and the Caribbean. Vicky, welcome, and it's over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. That's really great of you to be hosting this event, and thank you for focusing on this really important issue. Minister Amanda Millings is obviously responsible for our global health approach, but my focus has largely been on Africa, which has been, a major concern for vaccination rates. Just sort of by way of background, though, the UK has put a considerable commitment, both financially and with other resources and advice, for example, into the global effort to help vaccinate people across the world. We support ACTA. ACTA is the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, and it has a facility called COVAX. We've committed up to 813 million of new ODA money to ACTA. So we in the UK are one of the largest financial donors to date to try and help the rest of the world, especially the ODA eligible poorer countries, to get access to vaccines. Within that 813 million, 548 million of that, and that's pounds, is for COVAX. Of the 548, 500 million of it is for vaccinations, and the rest of it is for treatments, diagnostics, etc. We've made great progress. So, for example, in Africa, COVAX has given vaccinations, 430 million vaccinations to 44 different African countries. Then the UK also had a bilateral commitment that we would give 100 million bilateral doses. So far, 33.5 million of those doses have gone out. But the Prime Minister announced at the G20 last October that he would be putting in another 20 million AstraZeneca doses and 20 million Janssen, that's the Johnson & Johnson vaccinations. So that will take us to 70 out of the 100 million bilateral doses, and we expect to do the 100 million doses by the end of June. Just the sorts of countries that we've donated to: Angola, Antigua, and Barbuda, Bangladesh, Belize, Cambodia, DRC, Dominica, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, etc., etc. So all across the world, Vietnam, Thailand, Senegal, Nepal, Malawi, a huge range of different countries that we have donated to. Sometimes we get questions about how much of it is coming from the ODA budget. The cost of the vaccine donations in 2021 is additional to the ODA budget that was set out in the 2020 spending review, but it will be within the total ODA expenditure of the 0.5%. And we've now had guidance for reporting donations of excess vaccinations. There's been questions during last year mostly about vaccines that were being donated having quite short shelf lives. I'm pleased to say that issue is now much, much better. And in fact, over 90% of the doses that were delivered to COVAX in the last quarter of last year had 3 months or more in shelf life. For example, when I was in Uganda, I announced considerable bilateral donations that we were going to be doing of vaccinations, and they were all going to come in tiered shelf lives in accordance with when the country would working with them. We don't stockpile vaccinations in the UK, so this is not an issue of us holding back vaccinations. We do give the vaccinations out according to our bilateral donations, but we do that where there is supply chain reliability. So when we have a vaccines available to donate, then the Foreign Secretary prioritised how they're shared, and at least 80% of them go into COVAX with no earmarking. We also don't take doses from COVAX that we don't need. Okay. In terms of Africa, so it is really concerning, and I meet the vaccination team. I've been meeting them once a week since the beginning of January for the week summit in the country. We don't have data for last week because the UNICEF data system wasn't working, but the last figures we have are 18th of February. 17% of the African population had received at least one dose of the vaccine. That compares to 62% globally. Of those, that was 687 million vaccine doses in Africa, and of that, 430 million had come through COVAX. The African Union's AVAT system also had provided another 44 million doses. Some countries have done much better than others. So, for example, I was in Ghana last week, where they've been quite ahead of the curve and done some very clever stuff, including using drones to get vaccines out to hard to reach parts of the country. But in other parts of Africa, it has been a major challenge. In the conversations I've had with countries, and especially a detailed conversation I had with the Africa Centre of Disease Control in January when I visited Ethiopia, they made it very clear that it is not supply of vaccines that is the issue. And in fact, the African Union told me that they wouldn't be ordering any more vaccines for AVA from when I met them mid-January until at least the end of February, because they had enough vaccine supply. The issue is much more about the mechanism for actually getting the vaccinations into arms. And I'm hesitant to use the word vaccine hesitancy here, because it's a phrase that in the UK we tend to use with somebody who's sort of scared or worried about what impact the vaccine may have on them, and therefore may choose not to have the vaccine. Whereas in many of the countries I visited, it's not that people are necessarily scared by the vaccine or concerned by it. It's how high a priority does it come in your life. If you're going to have to, for example, spend half a day traveling to a clinic and give up the ability to earn money for the day and put that ahead of your other priorities, feeding your family, gathering water, etc., then having a COVID vaccine, when not very many people have been dying recently from COVID, may not be one of your priorities. So there is this sort of issue that is explained to me that is much more complicated necessarily than vaccine hesitancy. We've been working therefore with a number of different countries in order to help to look at how the vaccine distribution actually happens. So, for example, we put £4 million into South Africa's Solidarity Fund, which is including support for logistics. We deployed members of the emergency medical teams in the UK to 11 different countries. And we've also provided lots of other different bits of equipment, such as test kits, PPE, ventilators, etc. We're also doing a considerable amount of work on vaccine manufacturing. So, for example, we've worked to help produce business plans for manufacturing facilities in Senegal, in South Africa, and Morocco. So it was UK work that led the development of, for example, the Pasteur Institute in Senegal's plans for building a vaccine, a COVID vaccination facility. It's an interesting organisation because it's been the organisation that has been producing yellow fever vaccines for many, many years. But there is a need to increase vaccination manufacturing on the continent. And we've very much been working with others across the world to look at how you can get a better production facility working in key countries. And indeed, just last week, the WHO announced 6 different countries who will be sharing technology and will be partnering with South Africa on mRNA technology. And those countries are Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Tunisia, I think, and South Africa themselves. So there is work going on. It is going to take some time. But as I said, at the moment, the main issue is not necessarily supply, it's the distribution and the prioritization. The other issue, Paul, that comes up quite a lot is about licensing. We very much back the Oxford AZ model of voluntary licensing in order to expand the production of affordable vaccines. It was our government support that helped their transfer of technology and to establish those 20 supply chains across the world. So we are concerned about the TRIPS waiver proposal because we do think there's a serious risk that the TRIPS waiver could undermine the intellectual property framework that helped to produce the COVID-19 vaccines in the first place. And it does risk disincentivizing future research and development information. Then the only last thing I'll say is that on the 8th of March, so in just a few days' time, the UK is going to be hosting the Global Pandemic Preparedness Summit, and that is to raise funds to achieve CEPI's goal to develop vaccines against new health threats in 100 days and to rapidly scale up regional manufacturing for affordable global supply. That strategy was endorsed by the G7 and the G20. And so this 100 days goal will be a dramatic change in the way that the world will be able to react to new diseases in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vicky, very much. I'm now going to go over to Romilly Greenhill, who is UK's national director, and who in a previous life led on aid transparency at DFID. So Romilly, welcome, and it's now your turn.
Many thanks, Paul, and many thanks, Minister, for the overview of the UK support on vaccine. So I was thinking about the question about global Britain's role in ending the pandemic everywhere. And my starting point, I think, very similar to that of the Minister, is to really end the pandemic everywhere. We need to do three things. We need to roll out vaccines around the world in order to meet the target that the G20 has set, which is to ensure that 70% of people in all countries are fully vaccinated by the middle of this year. It's not all that far off. We also need to think about treatments, and we also need to roll out tests. And that's absolutely vital. And I was thinking about the role for global Britain, and I was thinking a bit about a marathon runner. Now, I've never run a marathon, sadly, but I know that what happens is that people start very fast and they sprint and they come out of the blocks and they go very, very rapidly at the beginning. And then there's a certain point in the middle of the marathon when they might start to flag a little bit. And my concern is that the UK has done a fantastic amount in the early stages of the pandemic. The Minister referred to many of the initiatives and the funding contributions the UK has made to the ACT-A financing initiative. Obviously, we played an absolutely key role with the AstraZeneca vaccine. We led the way at the G7 summit last year to get commitments around dose sharing. But it feels a little bit now that we're flagging a bit. We're in the middle of the marathon. We're getting a little bit tired. And we absolutely need to keep up the pace. So I think what we need to do is take some energy gels, whatever it is that marathon runners take to get them to the end of the marathon, just to make sure that we can get there and we can speed up and we can really play our role in ending this pandemic. So you might ask, why even run the marathon? You know, why is this so important? Why is it so important for us to speed up and get to the end of the race? Why do we need to support rolling vaccines around the world? And I think there are three main reasons that I want to highlight. The first is really the moral case, and I think that the Minister has touched on some of this. It's the right thing to do. You know, there's only 7% of people in low-income countries are fully vaccinated to date. The Minister highlighted some of the data from Africa. We still have far too low levels of vaccination around the world. And that's just not morally right. You know, we are all benefiting here from vaccination. We are enabled to live a fairly normal life now because most of us are vaccinated. The same thing should be true of countries around the world. It's also very much the smart thing to do. It's a smart thing to do for two reasons. One is, if we don't have vaccines around the world and we don't have tests and we don't have treatment, there is a real risk that we get another variant that comes back and impacts us. We all saw the risks with Omicron. Many of us were quite frightened about where we're going to go back into another lockdown, what was going to be the long-term impact on the UK. Fortunately, it hasn't worked that out that way, but actually the next variant may not be so kind to us. So I think there's a real risk on the health side. There's also, frankly, a real economic benefit to the UK of rolling out vaccines. The International Chamber of Commerce last year did some analysis which showed that the UK would benefit to the tune of £74 billion this year alone if there was equal access to vaccines around the world. So that's an enormous economic benefit. It's absolutely orders of magnitude greater than our aid budget. So it's something we should really think about. And the final reason for taking further action is that it has very strong public support. we did some polling earlier this year, and we found that 3/4 of people agreed that ending the pandemic globally should be a priority for the UK government in 2022, while nearly 2/3 agreed that if new variants are likely in countries that have low levels of vaccine access, we should prioritise ensuring that COVID-19 vaccine is available everywhere over additional 4th booster shots for the UK. So there's really strong support for further action. So what do we need to do? What's the sort of real life equivalent of the runner's energy gels, if I can continue that analogy? There's really 3 things I want to highlight. One is money. So if we're going to make sure that we get vaccinations, not just vaccines, if we can actually distribute what we have shared already with countries and manufacturers already, we do need more money to support that rollout, which is so absolutely vital. We need to do more on manufacturing. It's very good to hear the minister talk about the progress that has happened so far, but we need to go further and faster to make sure that we don't, in the long run, have any challenges around supply. And we do need to see more doses shared now. If we do those 3 things, we can finish the marathon, we can get our medal, and we can end the pandemic everywhere. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Paul. Many thanks.
Romilly, thank you very much. And next I'm going to go to Dan Poulter, who I can see in his Commons office, if I'm not mistaken. And Dan is the MP for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich. But personally to this discussion, he's the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on global health. So Dan, welcome, and it's now your turn to speak.
Thank you, Paul. I also have, for my sins, been working on the front line of the NHS throughout much of this pandemic, so seen firsthand the effects of COVID in this country. But it's a pleasure to be talking about what more we can do as a country to help lower middle income countries manage better in the face of what has been a devastating 2 years for the whole of the world in managing COVID. Paul, I very much, at the beginning, you framed this debate by asking about what could be done. Is this about how do we support lower middle income countries? Is this about opening up the economy? Is it about improving trade? Is it about debt relief? But my view would be that to unlock all of these, the priority for now has to be about getting needles into arms and improving access to vaccines. And the government certainly can be commended for the leadership it's shown on this at the G7 summit last year. It can be commended for what it has done in making a pledge to ensure that there are 100 million doses made available internationally by June 2022. And the government can also be commended for what it did in terms of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in removing the patent from that vaccine. And it's a great pity that many other vaccine manufacturers didn't do the same thing, because I'm sure that would reduce the cost of vaccines and make many more vaccines available to lower middle income countries if other manufacturers had taken perhaps a more ethical or perhaps more internationalist and moral approach. But unfortunately, in some cases, profit came first. It is, I think, as Romilly said quite rightly, about tests, treatments and vaccines for, as we look forward about how we support low middle income countries. But vaccines unlocks many of the other things. If we want to realise the economic benefits of trade with low and middle income countries, if we want to support the economies of those countries, we've got to make sure that we can help them to open up again as the pandemic becomes endemic. And the case is not just one. This is not just a case that we're making here on behalf of the moral case that we have to support low and middle income countries, but there's also national interest in this as well. We saw before Christmas the global fears about the Omicron variant. Fortunately, that proved to be less severe than was initially feared. But there will be many more variants that come in future. We do not have a guarantee, and we don't know whether those variants are going to increase, always going to be milder than the one before. And if we look at the history of viruses, and we look at the influenza virus, for example, we know there can be bad years for flu where we have a particularly virulent strain of the virus. So the potential for future mutations of the COVID virus remains. And it's very much in our interest, if we want to protect our economy and we want to protect our own nation's health, to ensure that the whole of the world is vaccinated. But let's just look at this very, I think there's some key points that I need to make, and I think Vicky may want to respond to some of these, because yes, the government's done a lot that can be commended for. But if we look at the fact that 71.8% on the most recent statistics that I have of the UK population is fully vaccinated, and we compare that to just 6.6% of people in low income countries being fully vaccinated, with only 12.6% having received even a first dose, and that may be 17% receiving a first dose in Africa, but the comparisons are very clear. 6.6% in low-income countries fully vaccinated to 71.8% of the UK population being fully vaccinated. If we then recognise the fact that the government has made that commitment, quite rightly, to vaccinate the world, if the government's made that commitment to donate 100 million doses of the vaccine by June 2022, that's a very good commitment to make. But with only 4 months left until that deadline, the government looks set to fall very short of that initial amount. And in response to a parliamentary question that was laid on the 14th of February, only a third of those vaccine doses have so far been donated to date, so 32.2 million. So we've got 4 months to get to that 100 million target. And the government will need to donate 16.95 million doses per month by my maths, as I was sitting here waiting to speak, in order to meet that target. So a long way to go. So I think it's very important that we match the rhetoric to the reality as we go forward, and we see that Vicky in her role takes this forward with with enthusiasm to make sure that we do meet that 100 million target. But in conclusion, Paul, if we want to support the economic development, the trade of low and middle income countries, if we want to support opening up those countries to trade in the post-Brexit world, if we want to help to relieve the debt burden, all of those things come back to meeting the crisis that's been thrown up by the pandemic. If we don't get those needles into arms, we won't be able to meet those challenges. And if that doesn't convince people, then self-interest should, because we may well face another very challenging variant of COVID in the months and years ahead, and we need to make sure that Britain plays its part in protecting itself, but also standing up for the moral duty that we owe to low and middle income countries. And I look forward to hearing from Vicky later on how we're actually going to turbocharge the effort to meet that 100 million target, which we're woefully short of meeting at this moment in time.
And thank you very much. Just 2 quick points before I go to our final speaker. One is that Vicky has to go at about 7:45. So I think everyone knows that now. Second is, please do, if you are a participant in this event, and I can see there are well over 70 people online, do put in a question through the Q&A function. I will do my best to get it to members of the panel. So finally, I want to come to Bruce Aylward, who's held a number of leadership positions at the World Health Organization, but is presently head of access to COVID-19 Accelerator tool, which is basically an international collaboration to fast track the development and the fair distribution of vaccines and therapeutics. So Bruce, welcome, and you're online now.
Thank you very much, Paul. And if I understood your first comment correctly, it meant be brief, Bruce. That was what you were trying to say. We don't want to lose the minister a chance to respond. I'd like to make three perhaps big points to help contribute to the conversation, because so much has been said. But the first one, Paul, and thanks to you for hosting this, but thanks to the United Kingdom, thanks to Great Britain. You have a glorious history, quite frankly, in infectious diseases. I spent 30 years of my life trying to eradicate and control infectious diseases. And so much of it is anchored in the United Kingdom's history, and whether it is all the way back to Jenner and smallpox vaccines, through to what you've done on AIDS, TB, malaria, and even today, of course, from what you've done with the AstraZeneca vaccines. I, as you may have seen in the bio, spent part of my training in the UK, and it was no accident. It was because of the technical expertise, among others, that you brought to infectious diseases. And on behalf of the ACT Accelerator that Paul referred to, I just also want to thank you as well, before we say, well, what would help going forward, just to say what's helped so far. The UK has brought its political weight through the G7, and last year, as you heard from Dan and the minister and others, to the ACT Accelerator, to the equitable distribution of these tools. You brought your financial weight with over $1 billion in contributions to equitable access. You've brought tools such as the AstraZeneca vaccine and a lot of technical expertise. You cannot find a WHO technical expert group that does not include citizens from your country and their contribution. So I've used a lot of my time to say thank you, and that's appropriate, Paul, as we look forward. But the next thing I want to say a few words about, well, is that this contribution you've made has made a difference. The UK invested smart in the ACT Accelerator. You invested in the vaccines part, but also in the testing part and also in the treatment part, because you need all three to be able to end this pandemic. It's like trying to manage the economy relying only on taxation. You can't rely only on vaccines. You've got to be smart, as Dan said, across them and Romilly. And you've been doing that, which is great. Over 1 billion doses are in in adults, mainly in low-income countries because of the contributions. 200 million tests in mainly low-income countries, and hundreds and hundreds, actually over 1 billion items of PPE. And the important thing is, while that might seem small in the scale of the overall number of doses given around the world, over 80% of the vaccines that have been given in low-income countries and over 80% of the tests done have been as a result of contributions through and support to the ACT Accelerator and to COVAX, one of its 3 pillars. So the contributions through this route, they make a difference. They get to places where they wouldn't get otherwise. And that brings me to the third point I wanted to make is, why should this be important now? We're at a very dangerous point in the pandemic. In the North, the assumption is endemic virus, mild disease, but we have insurance against endemic virus, severe disease. Now in the South, the same narrative is playing out. That's where we're headed. The problem is there is no insurance. That's bad news for them in terms of the risk of death and disease. It's bad news for the UK because of the risk of variants, quite frankly. Remember, the Beta variant, the Delta variant, the awful wave of Delta you had, the awful wave of Omicron you just gone through, those viruses did not come from highly vaccinated countries. They came from areas where they've been unable to control the disease because they were unable to access vaccines for a year because high-income countries were using. It's as simple as that. And the result is we've put ourselves in epidemiologically the most dangerous possible position, where now, when we finally have the vaccines available, as the minister highlighted, it's very hard to use them. The danger there is, of course, this virus is out there, it's replicating, it's mutating. There will be more variants. There will be more variants of concern, but we didn't use the vaccine smart. So we have a window to try and change that. And that period, like Dan said, is now, which is going to require the continued generosity, quite frankly, of the UK. First, politically, using your voice. The UK has a physical presence in so many of these countries. It advocates, political leaders listen, and they understand that they need to prioritize this when the UK speaks. The second thing is on financing. You are very close to fair share financing first year around, for which we're incredibly grateful. To do that in this second year is crucial, because now is the time we've got to test and be able to find this thing. And the technical support as we go forward. Again, the UK has a fantastic history, fantastic talent in the country, and being able to tap that as we go forward. There are great examples. Low-income countries, Cambodia, 85% coverage, Rwanda, 60% coverage, right smack in the middle of Africa. Others, dozens of others that are well over 30, 40% now. Yes, there has been big problems, as I think it was Graham and others have highlighted on the chat. But what we need to do is look forward and mobilize now the resources we've just talked about to get the job finished, or at least get us into a safe place. Very, very much in the interest of the UK. The reality is you cannot be COVID-free if the world's not COVID-free. You cannot be COVID controlled, you cannot be COVID safe. It's as simple as that. And the last point I would make, you remember, and sorry, it's the one that'll keep you up at night, I'm afraid, but this virus will mutate. It is mutating right now as we speak. There will be viruses, variants that not only transmit well, but also cause severe disease and death again. It's a statistical reality. That's the problem we're facing. But we can do something about it. And again, Paul, just to hugely thank everyone on this call for everything the UK has done so far. It's made my job, which is a hard one, an awful lot easier, or a little bit easier, let's say. But with the continued support, hopefully I won't look at the same bags under my eyes if we ever see each other on a Zoom call again.
Bruce, thank you very much. Now, we're going to go into the Q&A part of the discussion. What I'm going to do, given that we have the Minister with us for only a limited amount of time, is just bombard Vicky with the questions that are coming in so she can answer them and also pick up the points that Dan has raised. So I'm just going to have the first question we've had from Kusene Diamini, whose name I apologize for mispronouncing, in Johannesburg, who basically asks, given that Africa, especially South Africa, has capacity to manufacture vaccines, is the UK supportive of buying vaccines from African manufacturers to enable these manufacturers to be key players in global vaccine supply chains? So, Vicky.
Thank you very much. It's a really good question. And actually, South Africa is one of the countries where we've worked at helping to put together the business case to enable manufacturers to come in to set up vaccine manufacturing. And by the way, can I just say that South African scientists have been absolutely phenomenally good. It's been a very good, strong partnership between South African scientists and UK scientists throughout this period. They have some exceptionally good scientists, especially on all the genomic sequencing, which was so important to identify COVID. In terms of where we buy vaccines from, obviously we've set up, a number of different contracts we've got in place already, but we've had vaccinations, that have been supplied from all over the world. So I can't see why, if we were going to be buying new vaccines from new countries, why we wouldn't be looking at that. I just wanted to go back though to what Dan said about, will the UK deliver its 100 million target of bilateral doses? Absolutely, yes, we will. I think it's absolutely right that the UK needed to focus on prioritising our own vaccinations. It's the first job of every government, is to try and make sure its own people are safe. And given especially the much more vulnerable population that we have in the UK than many other developing countries because of our older population, it was really important that we got those vaccines into our own arms. As I said, we don't stockpile vaccines. We've been sending them out to COVAX and others as they've become available. 30 million have already gone out. We've earmarked where the next 40 million are coming from. So I do believe we'll make that 100 million target, but it is not supply that's the issue. Okay, it's the getting them into people's arms. And maybe if I can just describe, some countries, Ethiopia, a country of 150 million people, 6 million of them live in Tigray, where there's been a violent war. 40% of the people in that part of the country are suffering from extreme lack of food. You know, do you prioritize getting a COVID vaccination or trying to stop the humanitarian aid blockage? Well, at the moment, I think you prioritize trying to stop the humanitarian aid blockage. There's also a deep drought in the south. Nigeria, again, huge country, 213 million people. Vaccinations can be working very well in and around the city areas, but when you go up north, where again, there's an awful lot of extreme violence and conflict, it is very difficult to get these sorts of things working. And then another story in Kenya, I saw it firsthand, extreme poverty on the coast, health systems not working very well. But I turned up at the vaccine clinic. Paul, you'll love this. And it's not only sort of brought you in and said, yes, you're entitled to the vaccine, but then they said, which one would you like? You know, if you go in room A, you'll get AstraZeneca, room B, you'll get Pfizer, and room C, you can have Janssen. It's not the supply that's necessarily the issue. Next question.
Just to ask if anyone else wants to come in briefly on that. Anyone? All right, Romilly, okay.
Yes, and I mean, I understand that the vaccine supply has increased significantly, which I think is fantastic news for the world. I do think this comes down to the financing, though, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Of us on this panel have mentioned the financing. I think we talked about, you know, the UK did step up to the plate at the beginning on the financing, but we do need to get the money right so that we can actually support that distribution, so we can get the vaccines out to the more difficult areas, so that we can help with the kind of the education and the community health workers and all the things that need to go alongside that vaccine distribution. And I think from a advocacy organisation perspective, that's one of the things we're really looking for this year.
And if I could just add, that is absolutely something we've been working with the World Bank as well on. The funding that they've made available for this can be used for those sorts of things. And that's why, but you've got to go country by country to the specifics, because every single one of them is different. And the strategy that I've been trying to look at is instead of the UK trying to help every single country, can we work with others to say, you know, we'll help this lot if you help that lot, etc. So trying to make it a bit more manageable, because it's incredibly complex.
I think Dan is indicating that he wants to come in. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, just very quickly. So I mean, I think that, you know, obviously there is an issue, there's a supply issue, and then there's a distribution issue. But if we look at, you know, predominantly the health structures in many low and middle income countries in Africa or elsewhere, we generally see a preponderance of fairly well developed or the better health centres tend to be in urban areas, and we see that the more rural areas where there's more diverse population have much less in the way of health infrastructure. So actually, if you're wanting to get out those 100 million doses and meet the target, you know, you've got concentrated populations in many low and middle income countries where there are actually the more developed health resources in many of those low and middle income countries. So I just wonder, Vicky, just push you a little bit on this. How are you actually going to actually you know, drive this forward? Because at the moment we're not going to meet the 100 million target, and I think, yes, we've done so much.
We will meet the 100 million target, Dan. We will meet the 100 million target. Well, that's not an issue, because that's been the 100 million target has been an issue of making sure that we got the vaccinations and the boosters in the UK first, and then release the rest of the supply. But you're right about, should you be targeting the urban areas first? And a lot of that has been happening. But the countries that I've been speaking to is getting out to the hard to reach, often rural areas where there's often an awful lot of other issues happening. That might be conflict, that might be famine, that might because we've had drought related famine. There's lots of other things. That what is your priority? Is it getting food aid, water aid into that country? Is it getting measles vaccinations into children? So, but that is how we're working through country by country. Okay,
Vicky, I'm going to fire one more at you. This one is from Robin Gwynn, who's basically asking, can't we give, he says, a much more visible lead in setting up vaccine manufacturing facilities in selected partner countries? This would be a good way to bring together our commercial, financial, technical and developmental expertise and bring huge post-Brexit goodwill for the UK and Africa, he says. So what's your take on that?
So, well, the most important thing that we have done is work with the 3 countries to put together the business plan to bring investors in. Okay, so for example, the Pasteur Institute that I mentioned in Senegal, we went to them very early on and said, we think that you would be a great organization in order to build a vaccine manufacturing there. And then we actually brought McKinsey in to do the business plan that is now being looked at to bring the international investment to it. But you do need to make sure that you've got the network of scientists, you've got to go through the whole process. You remember how long it took to develop a vaccination and get it accredited in the UK, where they were manufacturing and then they needed to go through the different sets of trials to get approved. This takes time to get a vaccine manufacturer set up, running, and then through an approvals process, which is why I'm told it's more complicated than I would like. I would love to be, cutting ribbons on vaccine factories that weren't just fill and finish, but that were actually making their own vaccines, in a number of months. But it just takes longer than that because you've got to get the different approvals as well.
Anyone else want to come in on that question? If you could raise a hand, Romilly.
Yes, I mean, I really welcome the question and the response, because actually when we've been listening to African governments and African civil society organizations, the number one thing that we're hearing from them is around domestic manufacturing capacity. So I think the African Union have got a target that something like 60% of their vaccines will be manufactured by 2040. So I really hear what you're saying in terms of the time. I think we need to be doing both in tandem. We need to be financing and supporting the immediate response to this pandemic, but we mustn't forget the longer term issue of actually sort of supporting that manufacturing capacity and the rollout, and really responding to those African priorities, because I think that's the most important thing at the end of the day.
I'm going to leave, but I'm going to tell you one more thing. So last Thursday I was in Ghana, and I was at the it's called WACBIP, which is their biochemistry center at the University of Ghana, funded by the Wellcome Trust, by the World Bank, of which we're one of the largest players. They are not only working on vaccinations and for COVID, but actually for many, many years we're working on much better vaccinations for malaria, which is the one that there's the absolute killer there. World-class scientists in that room. And when I went to ask the professors there, put your hand up if you're in partnering with a UK university or the Sanger Centre or the Francis Crick Centre or any of the other world leading centres that we have in the UK. Every single scientist in that room is doing their research in collaboration with the UK. We are leading on this, but sometimes we don't talk about it as much as we should do.
All right.
I'm going to leave you. Bye.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Minister, very much. And as you go, I noted that Bruce wanted to come in on that last question. So, Bruce, please do.
Yeah, Romilly made the point. It was really to talk about doing these things in tandem. The situation we have now and the gross inequity, it just reflects who controls production, who controls the means of distributing these. And if we had started at the beginning of this pandemic with trying to establish capacity in other places, it wouldn't have been days or weeks or months. We would now be years, and we would be making vaccines in those places, quite frankly, especially with some of the newer technologies that are available. So to the point Romilly made, it was just really to come in on the same point. And, we're in danger right now, Paul, of people saying the same thing. Well, it's going to take years. You know what? We could be dealing with this for some time yet. We'll certainly be dealing with new ones.
Okay, I have a question that really arises from Omicron. It is partly going over familiar ground, but I think it's quite an important one, which is this. When Omicron broke, no one could be quite sure how severe it would be. And what we learned in the course of time was it wasn't as severe as Delta. We were able to open up. There is a view that goes around, and one keeps reading in the media, which is basically this. It's, don't worry, these pandemics always start off very seriously, but then after a while they peter out, as Spanish flu eventually did after the First World War. And we've seen the back of COVID, and it's really all over. So how do you persuade people that that's simply not true? Because the more they believe that it is, the less likely there is to be able to build support for the practical element in the argue for supporting more global vaccination. So I don't know which of you wants to take that first. Yeah, Bruce.
No, I'm happy to take to explain that, not take a stab at it. First, this is the danger that we have right now is exactly that sense. And folks, what's at the heart of this is people think it's a linear progression. We've gone from the Alpha, turned into the Beta, turned into the Delta, turned into the Omicron. That's not what happened. What happened is we had the Wuhan original strain virus, which different ones have come out in different directions off, which means those other ones could still come off of some of those other earlier viruses. And the immunity you get against one, especially Omicron, not necessarily going to protect you against the others. Some of the earlier ones that people talk about, like Spanish flu, there you've been dealing with what was a relatively stable virus that over time people built up immunity to. This is a virus which you are getting major changes to what we call the antigenic part of that antigenic epitope, the part where that would confer immunity. And this is still surprising us. Remember, Delta and Beta, two of those ones that came off in different directions, they were probably more severe than the original strain of the virus. So it does not go in a linear progression to less severe disease. The second thing to remember is immunity against Omicron has not proven very robust and has not proven very robust against other variants. So the problem we have now is a whole lot of people in the world have been exposed to Omicron. They say, I've had this, I'm now protected. You're not. That's the reality.
Okay, who else wants to come in on persuading voters that COVID is still a serious challenge and that there's a big job to do in terms of global vaccination? Dan?
Yeah, we can do very quickly. I think Bruce made some very important points that I there. But if we take flu, and flu is a very different virus in many respects to COVID, but we had pandemic outbreaks of flu in 1918, in 1957, in 1968. They were the big three in the last century, and that just shows how a virus that we have historically been very familiar with can have years where a particularly virulent strain comes along and causes damage and disruption and death, and the damage and disruption is often economic, and death is obviously the result to citizens, and in particular those who are more vulnerable and susceptible to illness, immunosuppressed, the elderly. But actually, in this case of Spanish flu, a lot of younger people died as well. So we know from the lessons that we've learned from flu that actually a virus that we're very familiar with can still cause that sort of devastation. And I think that the key point that Bruce made that I think we've got to be emphasised is that the COVID virus has seen very rapid and major mutations in the space of just 2 years. Bruce is more of an expert in the epidemiology of this than I am, but the speed of change is unusual in a virus. I think it's caught us all by surprise, and what we don't know is whether we're going to get another mutation that comes along that is far more both deadly, but also, as we've seen with previous mutations, relatively resistant to the vaccine. And if you put those two things together, that's not good news. So this pandemic, if anyone who, I think it'd be a very foolish or very brave view to take, this pandemic is over.
And Romilly.
Yeah, thank you. So Bruce and Dan are much more qualified to speak on the health aspects of this than me, and I very much agree with what both of them have just said. I do think we need to think about the economic dimension of this as well. I mentioned the figures earlier in terms of the impact of the UK of rolling out vaccine access, but unless we can actually end this pandemic around the world, it's also going to have a long-term impact on the UK economy. We're already seeing huge challenges here in terms of fuel prices, in terms of gas prices, obviously now in the current climate. You know, unless we can end this pandemic around the world, we're going to end up with supply chains, we're going to end up with higher levels of inflation. At one point last autumn, I think something like 10% of the world's shipping containers were sitting in the sea, not able to get into ports because the ports were shut because of COVID outbreaks. And we saw, you know, factories in Vietnam and China and these sorts of areas which we're very reliant on in the UK being closed because of COVID outbreaks. So, you know, the point has been very, very well made on the health side, but I think on the economic side as well, we have a really, really strong incentive and interest in supporting ending the pandemic globally.
Okay, the next question is from Tom Griffiths, who asks, what assurances are there that the commercial and practical arrangements to increase vaccine rollout internationally are equitable, fair, and will not be money that will be wasted? Dan?
Thank you, but I'm just going to very quickly apologise. I will let someone else take the question because I'm going to have to head off, as you can hear from the voting bell in the background. But I suspect we've now got a round of votes, so I'm going to have to disappear. But can I just thank you very much for hosting, and it's been very enjoyable being part of the discussion, and I look forward to catching up on what I have missed another time. But thank you very much for hosting, and thank you to other panellists and to the audience as well. It's been enjoyable to be with you this evening.
Dan, thank you very much. So I will fire that question away at Romilly. I'll just read it again in case it disappeared beneath Dan's explanation for Galen.
I'm happy to take it, Paul.
Bruce, yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, because it's a super important point, and it really reflects, you know, the interest and the huge responsibility people on this call have for good stewardship of finances that are made available. So what we'd have done, because any kind of massive rollout like this can have exactly the risks that were highlighted, Paul. So what we have done is we have appointed, I don't like to use the term, especially these days, but sort of a vaccine delivery czar, let's say, excuse the terminology in the current context. But this person has been jointly appointed by WHO and UNICEF, the heads of them. We have a presence in 157 countries where we have teams, and sometimes the weaker the country, the bigger the team. So we have eyes and ears on the ground. And what we've done is, under the leadership of this person now, in every single one of the countries with the lowest countries coverage, we've established a single team, single plan, single budget, all working with government to do exactly what the question highlighted, to achieve efficiency in the use of resources, accountability in the use of resources, to try and optimize the impact that they can have. So there's a huge effort, and I could show you actually, Paul, every Friday, I think it is, I get the slide deck of about 70 or 80 different slides that shows me for every single country that's got coverage below 40%, the granularity around each one of the key indicators and who's doing what around it. So I think it's a fantastic question. It's a crucial question. You need to be able to go back to constituencies and say, look, there are whole teams on the ground in these places who are doing exactly that, making sure that your money is going to the purposes intended and having the impact it could. Part of that I should have highlighted as well, these teams, they reach out beyond, you know, the WHO, the UNICEF, the usual, the World Banks. They reach out to the private sector, they reach out to civil society organizations to try and bring them all into that single tent, single plan, single budget, because that is the key to getting to efficiencies, getting transparency on what's happening, which ultimately improves the accountability and the impact of the resources.
And Romilly, I think you got the question, which is what guarantee is there that the vaccines will be used equitably and money won't be wasted? When you used to do aid transparency at DFID, so you'll be very familiar with this territory.
Indeed, and I mean, I wanted to say that transparency is absolutely critical, both transparency to taxpayers and funders in in the north, but also to people in low and middle income countries where the benefits, where the vaccines are supposed to be rolling out. So one of the things that we learned when I worked on the Aid Transparency Initiative is that actually the more transparent you can be, the more money then actually gets down to the places that it needs to and gets to the health clinics and so on and so forth. So I think that's absolutely critical. Let's not forget that this isn't the first time we're doing a big global vaccine rollout. You know, we do have Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, we have the Global Fund, we have the WHO. We've actually got a lot of experience of rolling out vaccines around the world. And in fact, organizations like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, have been enormously successful. 760 million children vaccinated around the world. So we do know we've got the tools to do this. We've had enormous success on other issues. So I personally feel very confident. I think Bruce has articulated very well some of the specific mechanisms that are put in place to make sure that we actually deliver.
Paul, I just wanted to come back because I missed the first part of that, which was about equitable use, which is so important, right? We need to make sure they don't just go to the country, but they go to the right people in the countries. So every country that signs up for vaccines through COVAX, they have to agree to a stepped use of these, which makes sure first it goes to the healthcare workers to protect your front line. Second, it goes to the older populations. Next, those with comorbidities, et cetera. And then that's built into the national plan that I mentioned. And then that's built into the monitoring and surveillance done by the whole teams that are out there. So I did want to say it's all anchored in equitable access. They have to agree to a certain values and certain order by which people are vaccinated. And last point, Paul, just to remind everybody on this call, every country in sub-Saharan Africa has eradicated polio. To do that, they had to get over 80 and sometimes 90% vaccination coverage, not one time, multiple times, as part of the massive campaigns that we ran through the 90s and the early parts of the 2000s, again, that the UK championed. So you've created a whole knowledge. People know how to get to their populations. They know how to get them vaccinated there. So this is very much doable.
Next question is from Kahinde Adanye. Which is this: one of the biggest challenges in Africa is, the next words are in quotes, low knowledge of the importance of the vaccine. The question then goes on, how does the UK plan to help the awareness raising on vaccination in different languages in Africa? I mean, that's a question I could have put to the minister. I suppose more broadly, how does the UK and other countries raise awareness of the importance of the vaccine? So, I mean, Bruce, this is bang in your territory, so I'll put the question to you.
Yeah, absolutely delighted to. It's one of the most important parts of what we do, right? Everything about trying to stop COVID is all about, at a certain level, behavior changes, right? Which require changing mindsets, which require people having the right information from the right channels to be able to do that. So there's a huge part of our work, which is focused simply on information, ensuring the right information, the right evidence is not going out through it, but exactly as you've said, through the right languages, through the right channels. This means tribal leaders, political leaders, community leaders, religious leaders. We have huge experience doing that. And well, let's say the countries have huge experience through the polio campaigns that I mentioned, the measles campaigns, I think the minister mentioned, and Romilly mentioned the work with Gavi. So there's a lot to build on there. Some agencies more specialized than others in this, WHO on the evidence side, but UNICEF very much for what we call C4D, communications for delivery, et cetera. But these folks have a long, we're always learning. We haven't got everything right if we've seen the rollout of these vaccines, but we are learning and have a lot of experience to build on. There's some great expertise in the UK, London School of Tropical Medicine, other places deeply involved in our expert committees that help drive this work as well.
And Romilly.
Yeah, and just to add a really concrete example of that, when I worked in Cambodia some years ago with ActionAid, this was wider than vaccination, but the donors were working with what they call the Wat grannies. So the Wats are the temples in Cambodia, and the Wat grannies, I guess they were a little bit like the sort of nuns in Call the Midwife, if anyone watches that program. But they were the women who were associated with the temple, but because they were there, they were very much trusted with by the community. So what they would do is they would encourage all the women to bring the children to see the what grannies, and then the what grannies would talk to them about the importance of child health and the broad childhood vaccinations. So it's just a kind of really concrete example of illustrating Bruce's point. It's not to say that there's no issue with vaccine hesitancy. It's just that actually, if you invest in the right way, you can overcome some of the challenges and working through those local institutions, the local leaders and people who are respected by the communities. That is a really good way of overcoming these issues, and it's very vital work.
Okay, I have a question which really picks up something that I heard Bruce say earlier. Bruce was going through statistics about vaccinations. I think he said, for example, 60% vaccination rate in Rwanda. And it made me think, what in simple terms are the biggest obstacles to vaccination? Are they war? Are they regional distribution? Are they cultural resistance? Are they governments not doing their bit? Is there no single explanation? And then the next question that follows from that is there one particular thing that the British government and British-led agencies tend to be good at? And if so, does that apply everywhere? Or in fact, are there a number of things that the British are good at in terms of vaccine distribution? And if so, what? So that's quite a complicated question, but it's essentially all about the variation in vaccination rates. So I don't know who wants to go first this time.
No, I'm happy to take a stab at it. Not a stab, to answer it. So when we look at what are the barriers to vaccination, the way to really think about it is a supply-demand situation. So for the first year, it was very much a supply-driven problem. The problem we have now is by not solving the supply problem, we've created a demand problem, wherein now there are questions about which vaccines should people use? Why should they get vaccinated if they're not getting vaccinated in the West anymore? Why are we using these donated vaccines if they don't want them anymore? Many problems like that. But in terms of the big challenges, the first thing you need is the supply side solved. Once that's solved, you need the political buy-in, because you have got to mobilize your communications, your education, your transport ministries, your et cetera. So you need the political leadership involved. The second thing you need is a workforce that can be able to do this, a huge surge of workforce to be able to get this many vaccines into this many people. Completely possible to do, and these countries have experience doing it. But to do that, you need the financing, and Romilly hired this. You need enough money to pay people basic per diems to be able to do this kind of work, because it takes them away from important things like trying to feed their family on a day-to-day basis. It's hand-to-mouth survival for lots of people in these countries. So you need that workforce. And then behind that, of course, you need the logistics, which is not the hard thing to solve. People in sub-Saharan Africa are used to solving logistical problems. They're really, really good at it. But they got to have the financing, people, political support to be able to do it. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of dealing with hesitancy and prioritizing something like this. But that's where that mobilization of communities and leadership. The UK has got expertise across the board on these things. It's got years and years, not only in your own country, but also overseas. A fantastic experience. And I would come back again, Paul, the one we talked about at the beginning. Use your voice, use your diplomatic services, use the people who have access high to governments and to other players and in the country to make that case. Use the technical expertise that you have in these countries. There's lots of UK businesses we've seen in the chat. Get them involved to help solve logistical problems, not just themselves, but they can mobilize communities. I have to come back to where we started. The UK was very generous financially, so we bought a lot of vaccine. We need that generosity now to help the delivery, getting the vaccines into arms.
Romilly.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to that from my experience of sort of both having worked for DFID and also being a sort of UK aid watcher for a number of years. I think there's two things the UK's always been very, very good at. One is at the country level, thinking beyond the individual project and program, but to sort of the whole system. So I think now this is a really good example with COVID. Let's not just tackle the COVID issue, or incredibly important though that is, let's also think about how we can use that to strengthen the whole health system. And that will actually in the long run help to deal with some of the issues we've been talking about how do you get vaccines and treatments out to very rural areas? How do you overcome issues about hesitancy? All these things. If you can actually strengthen the system as a whole, then that will be beneficial for this pandemic, for future pandemics. So I think the UK has been very, very good at that. And I think the other point is actually around sort of how do you look at the multilateral system? How do we get people to work together? The UK was very important at the beginning of the ACT Day initiative that brought together key partners to tackle the pandemic. How do we think about how do we make the sort of the big multilateral organizations work effectively? Because the UK has had for the last 20 years, very strong, very high levels of development expertise and be really well trusted and valued for that reason. I think that there's a kind of key role the UK has played and I think should continue to play going forward.
Okay, the next question, which is probably the last one because we're down to our last 4 minutes, is from Robert Yates. It's really a question that would be good to have the Minister answer, but it's also worth thinking about, which was this. Robert Yates asked, on last week's Panorama, there you go, Dr. Aylward reported that hundreds of thousands of people have died to date because of vaccine inequity. Will, I'm going to read that as should, the UK commit to paying its fair share to ACTAR, ACT-A, to help close these coverage gaps, which will help protect the British people too? Romilly and then Bruce.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I very much hope the UK does put in the financing that's needed, because I think it's absolutely right. And I think, I've come back to this point throughout this evening that if we don't have the money and if the UK doesn't pay the fair share, it's going to make the global effort on tests and treatment as well as vaccines really, really difficult. And remember this, we're talking about fair shares. This is not about the UK taking a disproportionate burden. There's a lot of work that is done to work out, which donor needs to contribute, and countries obviously are funding a lot of this themselves. We should pay our fair share. We didn't put in very much at all in 2021. So in 2020, as the Minister said, there was a large contribution up front, which was very welcome. Last year, I think we put in almost nothing, something like £16 million. For the size of the UK economy, we really didn't meet our fair share in 2021. So in 2022, it's going to be absolutely vital that the UK, despite the aid cuts and despite all the difficulties that we've had here, we need to do that for the benefit of our health, our economy, and most importantly for people in low-income countries.
And Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. To come in on this point from a slightly different perspective, I think very definitely the UK should pay its fair share, and that's easy for me to say as a non-UK citizen, I guess, but I do pay taxes still in Canada, and I do think we should pay our fair share as well. And that's because it's a fantastic buy. We are hemorrhaging money from the global economy, and we will continue to, because part of the problem, so much of the growth of the UK economy is not going to come from high-income vaccinated countries. It's going to come from low middle-income countries and some of the lower upper middle-income countries. These are where the growth in the economy is. These ones are stagnating. They're in trouble. And part of the problem is they simply are not reintegrated the way they need to be, and they're not vaccinated, so there's still problems. And they're not testing, so they can't prove that they're safe. So it's a great, it makes great economic sense, but you know this better than I do. The other thing I would suggest is that the fair share calculations, which have really been generated based on the size of the economy, openness, et cetera, really works in the UK's favor as well. Because we've heard already Germany has come out saying they will pay their fair share this year. We've heard that Canada, who did last year, very interested to do it again. For the UK, it would be about $1 billion US, I guess it's about 800 million pounds. Again, it is a lot of money, but it is a fraction of the cost of not acting. And if the UK and Germany and Canada come together and try to leverage that kind of commitment from the rest of the G7 and then the G20, you can really leverage your money. And the fair share allows you to leverage. That's the big advantage of going at it that way as well. Paul, thank you. I always feel rather brazen speaking that way, but this is where it's a great, it's in the interest of, for so many reasons for so many people.
Bruce, so thank you very much. Our time is up, and I suppose if there was a message or a common theme from the discussion, maybe it would be to go back to Romilly's marathon metaphor and look at it in the sense of the British runner maybe being tempted to say, well, on the moral case, it's all petering out, isn't it? And on the practical case, well, it's not going to be a problem anymore because we won't get a severe variant. And if there was one theme running through the conversation this evening, it was it's not over worldwide. So the moral case is still very lively. And it's not necessarily the case there won't be another severe variant. So the practical case runs alongside it too. At any rate, I want to thank really three lots of people. One is, as it were, the One campaign, our partner in this event. The other, Bruce and Romilly, are both of you as speakers, and also to thank our absent members of Parliament, Vicky, the Minister, and Dan Poulter. And finally, to thank all of you for bearing with us in very substantial numbers. Apologies to those of you who couldn't get your questions in, but thank you for joining us this evening. And it's a farewell from me and my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.